For over 30 consecutive years, my grandfather owned and operated a highly successful, secluded fishing camp nestled deep within the rugged mountains of West Virginia. It was a rustic, traditional establishment consisting of 8 small timber cabins positioned along a pristine, trout-filled mountain creek. It was a word-of-mouth operation, catering to a wealthy, dedicated fly fishing clientele. The same families would reserve the exact same cabins every summer for generations. I spent the entirety of my childhood summers running wild across that property, and I eventually worked there as a maintenance hand throughout my 20s before my grandfather finally sold the land and retired. I know every single boulder, every deep pool in that creek, and every hidden hollow on that mountain better than any other place on earth. There was a steep, well-defined trail that originated directly from the back of the property and ascended sharply into the towering ridge above the cabins. It was a legitimate, carefully maintained trail that wound up roughly 2 miles to a jagged rock outcrop known as the viewpoint, which offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire valley. The fishing guests would frequently hike up there in the late afternoons to watch the sunset. However, my grandfather enforced one absolute, non-negotiable rule regarding that trail. Under no circumstances was anyone permitted on it after dark. This applied to staff, family, and paying guests alike. The official justification he provided to the public was that the loose shale footing above the third switchback was incredibly hazardous, and that from a legal standpoint, the insurance liability was simply too high to risk a nighttime injury. It was a perfectly logical explanation. The footing was genuinely terrible on that upper section, so for decades, absolutely nobody questioned his authority on the matter. It was only years later, after the property had been sold and the camp was gone, that the truth came out. We were sitting on his back porch on a warm summer evening, sharing one of those long, quiet conversations that old men have when they are finally wrapping up their life's work, and I decided to ask him plainly if the insurance liability had been the real reason for the rule. My grandfather went completely still. He stared out into his yard for a long, heavy minute before he finally answered. He told me that when he had initially purchased the mountain property 40 years prior, the previous owner had walked him up that specific trail and shown him something highly unusual at the viewpoint. My grandfather looked at me and stated flatly that he would not describe what he saw to me, and he strictly forbade me from ever attempting to hike up there to look for it. All he would say was that it was a physical anomaly that had existed on that high ridge for a very long time, placed there for a purpose he could not comprehend. The previous owner had passed down a strict generational mandate. You could visit the viewpoint during the bright hours of daylight, leave the area entirely undisturbed, and nothing would ever happen. But you did not go up there at night. At night, the ridge belonged to something else. My grandfather admitted to me that during his first year operating the camp, fueled by youthful arrogance, he had decided to hike up the trail after midnight to see for himself what happened when the sun went down. He never made it to the top. He turned around and fled back down the mountain before he even cleared the final switchback. He told me that as he was ascending through the pitch black, he suddenly heard heavy, deliberate footsteps on the trail directly above him. It wasn't the scattered clutter of a frightened deer or the heavy crash of a bear. He said it was the distinct, unmistakable sound of something that knew the exact geometry of that trail perfectly. Something moving down the path toward him with absolute stability and rhythm. My grandfather told me that what made him turn back wasn't a sudden panic or primal fear. It was something far more profound. It was a deep, bone-chilling realization that whatever was walking down that trail had a historical claim to that mountain that predated human existence by centuries. His presence on that trail at that ungodly hour was a profound, disrespectful intrusion upon an ancient cycle he had no right to witness. The only polite, correct, and survival-oriented choice was to turn around and walk away. He explained that the previous owner had shared an identical story. He too had attempted a nighttime ascent in his youth, only to be turned back by the rhythmic sound of footsteps descending from a summit. More terrifyingly, that previous owner claimed that decades before his time, a local man had ignored the warnings and hiked up to the viewpoint at night. He never came back down. They searched the ridges for weeks, but not a single trace of his gear, clothing, or body was ever recovered. That disappearance was the true origin of the rule. It had nothing to do with insurance. It was a boundary born of absolute respect for a prior claim to the dark hours. My grandfather passed away shortly after that conversation, leaving me with more questions than answers. I was never able to press him for further details about what sat at the top of that trail. Since his passing, I have returned to that mountain twice. The property is under entirely new corporate ownership now. The historic cabins have been heavily renovated into luxury rentals, catering to a completely different, oblivious clientele. During both visits, I hiked the trail during the bright midday sun, stood at the viewpoint, and looked directly at what was up there, the anomaly my grandfather had refused to describe. I am also going to honor his memory by refusing to describe it here. But I will say this, standing there in the stark, blinding light of a Tuesday afternoon, I completely understood why the rule existed. I understood with absolute clarity that my grandfather was right. There is an oppressive, suffocating quality to that specific spot, a heavy, ancient weight that I simply do not possess the vocabulary to accurately articulate. Even in the bright sunshine, the air feels old, still, and deeply unwelcoming. As I drove home from those trips, my mind kept looping back to that lone hiker who had ventured up into the dark all those decades ago. I found myself wondering if he had heard those heavy footsteps descending the trail toward him, and if he had made the fatal decision to ignore his gut and keep walking up into the blackness anyway, and exactly what he encountered waiting for him at the threshold of the peak.